Hello and welcome to the exotic build order tutorial. In this video I'm going to show you some build orders that actually kind of qualify to be generic build orders, meaning stuff you can use on lots of maps, so knowing them is important. On the other hand, they are not so common that they deserve to be included into the first beginner video I made. So this stuff is rare, but still good to know. And not map specific. That's my point. So you can use this on multiple maps. This very build order, for example, the dual land hydro rush, that's something you can use on Canis River, Open Palms, Badlands, stuff like that, right? So it's not just a Badlands build order. The idea of this build order is that you build 2 land factories before you go for the hydro, or actually while you go for the hydro. That's because the hydro is kind of close, but it's also kind of far away. So you want to have the hydro early, but you don't want to sacrifice the build power of your ACU, because if the ACU walks there, then you are losing precious time to scale up your production. So instead you're going to use the ACU to build 2 factories and just enough power to run these. And from previous videos, you know that you need 5 power generators to run 2 factories and still build stuff, right? But in this build order, we are just going to use 4 power generators, and it is calculated in a way that we are just barely not stalling. So you cannot use this BO if you don't have a hydro nearby. That makes up for the lack of power generators. But as you can see here, the bar is just not empty, also thanks to a tiny bit of tree reclaim. And this is giving us time to finish the hydro. And now both bars are almost empty, but we are not stalling. So good eco management with this BO. The first 2 engineers built the hydro and an air factory next to it. And you're going to have some excess energy, so you don't have to build extra power after finishing the air factory. You can even afford to assist the air factory with your ACU for a bit and get this bomber out. The land factory builds 4 engineers and 2 scouts and 2 tanks. And the 2 scouts are going to check out whether there is anything incoming. We don't need a scout on this side because the ACU is going to be there. And the tanks can either attack or defend. It depends a little bit on your faction. Cybran would rather attack, Aeon would rather defend, and for the others it doesn't really matter. So that's the idea pretty much. Engineer number 3 is the reclaiming engineer, and you find reclaim on all of these maps. There's reclaim on Open Palms, there's reclaim on Canis River, and there's reclaim on Badlands. And you're grabbing a little bit of tree reclaim, but mainly rock reclaim. Engineer number 4 is expanding, and then, as I said, you have the 2 tanks, 2 scouts, and after that infinite engineers. And your second factory is producing your standard army composition. And this way you are not going to be outproduced early on. And you can basically outproduce anybody who uses standard hydro rush. So the standard hydro rush BO is going to be a bit more economic usually, but the ACU walk time is going to give the hydro rushing person some trouble. Because by the time the ACU is walking, you have those extra factories and they are already producing tanks, whereas the enemy doesn't have the second factory making tanks. So that's how you should understand it. This BO can beat Hydro Rush BO on maps where the Hydro is too far away so that the ACU can build it without losing a lot of build power in your starting position. This is exotic build order number 2. And some of you have seen this already. I have talked about it on other occasions. This is first air, bomber first. Even though the bomber build time has been increased and the mass cost has been increased, the bomber has been buffed. If you don't micro it, it drops more bombs. So if you're okay with having the bomber later, then it can still deal a lot of damage. And especially on a map like this, where the expanding engineers are super important, it is a good way to open your build. Plus, the travel time of land units on this map is kinda high, so it takes a long time for enemy raid units to come. This is how the BO works. Your ACU starts with a power generator, then the air factory, and then 2 more power generators. After that, the ACU is going to build 4 mass extractors, and there could be 1 more power generator. It kind of depends on the map. So on this map, there is a hydro, and it is kind of close. So the next engineer after the bomber is going to build the the hydro, and the ACU is going to assist the hydro. So that's a modified hydro rush again. And since this works out quite nicely with the timing, the engineer finishes before the ACU starts this power generator, I can cancel this power generator and assist the hydro. But if the hydro is further away or there is no hydro, then you may have to build more power generators with the ACU. And the engineer would then possibly reclaim some trees so that you don't power stall. And you know, for the next land factory, you would have to add at least 4 power generators so you don't power stall. And the hydro is worth 5 power generators, which is why you can build 2 more land factories. And I'm going to build a 3rd one and add 1 more power generator so we don't stall. But these factors really depend on the map. This bomber should basically hit the base until you dealt a lot of damage and the base is ready to defend itself. And on this map there is a small pipe that is worth 300 mass. I don't know who put this here, and it's barely visible, but it's good to reclaim. And if the enemy doesn't prioritize it, you can bomb it, and it will die in 1 bomb. You can also bomb the hydro engineers, and after the base is defending itself, you fly to the sides and harass the expanding engineers. This map is pretty good for Aeon because of the hover tanks, so you can queue up your basic unit composition minus the RD, minus the anti-air, and simply send your stuff through the middle. You may want to dedicate your first scout and your first tank to protect the expanding engineer. And don't forget that your ACU is going to have to expand later as well and get in one of the corners, usually the one at the hydro side. And the air factory just keeps building bombers. And you want to build bombers as long as you get away with it and the enemy doesn't have interceptors. You only switch it to interceptors if the enemy starts building interceptors. So sometimes your bomber can put the enemy air factory into a factory lock, and then you can just keep building bombers. And if the enemy is building mobile anti-air but not microing it, you can bomb the anti-air and kill that as well. So usually if you want to counter bombers, you should use 2 counters. An interceptor and stationary anti-air, an interceptor and mobile anti-air, or stationary anti-air and mobile anti-air. Because even people with good bomber micro cannot take care of both. And overbuilding counters is not so tragic because it's going to keep you safe for the rest of the game. A bomber rush usually works against people who are too greedy to build 2 counters and just rely on 1, and then you can sometimes kill it. So this is how this build order works. Don't forget to add some power spam later from the engineers that occasionally come off these factories. And if you're okay with losing air control and the enemy already has some interceptors, then you can also build some engineers from this factory, add some extra air factories and win it back. Factory spam to engineers building land factories could work, and of course a navy is going to be relevant sooner or later, depending on whether your tanks are going to be able to deny the enemy naval production or not, and whether he rebuilds it elsewhere. So these were some things specific for this map, but you should have figured out that you can use first air bomber first into large-scale bomber spam and land spam on multiple maps. For example, you've seen it on Fields of Isis, and it also somewhat works on Canis River if you have very good bomber micro. So have fun with this BO. So let's move on to the 3rd exotic build order you can use on more than just one map. And I call this the Israel opening because I've been playing with some people from Israel, namely Marco and Shadows from the DnD-Clan. And they specialize on ending the game on the T1 or T2 stage. And they play team games. sometimes maps with a very late game centric meta, and the goal is to finish the game quickly and win instantly. So they've come up with lots of interesting builds, and this is one of them. And you can use this build on Gap, on Fields of Isis, on Dusty Mounts, on Corona, and probably on lots of other maps. And the only requirement is that you are on a slot where the ACU doesn't have to leave the base early, and you're going to use it on somebody whose ACU is going to leave the base early. And that's it. Here's how this works. You want to go for Hydro Rush, but since you start with the air factory and not with the land factory, you need one power generator before you build the standard 4 mexes with your ACU and move to the Hydro to assist it. The air factory builds at least 6 engineers and usually a maximum of 8 engineers. How many engineers you're building will depend on the map. This map has one expansion route your ACU is not going to cover. The ACU will go here, so there's going to be one engineer that goes here to capture these mexes. And they are so far away that the engineer will not be back at the air factory in time when this mex is done, and this air factory is finishing the transport. So that's why you need one extra engineer on this map. And if you're playing on a map with more faraway expansion routes that can only be covered by engineers, you're going to add 8 engineers before you do the scout, transport, bomber, scout thing. And of course on maps where you don't need to expand at all, these maps exist too, because you only have core mexes, then you can go for 6 engineers. So all engineers that are gathering around the factory, which is all but this one, right, are going to assist the factory that's building more engineers. And as soon as we have 6 engineers next to the factory, we can start the scout and the transport. And note that I'm using the downtime where the factory is not producing to line up the engineers a little. You can see normally they would probably be standing here and here and here and whatever, but they are all in one line. And that's simply by giving a movement order before giving the assist order. And that's how I'm going to speed up the loading process of the transport. See, I'm already moving the transport here. In the meantime, the scout is arriving, checking out what's there, and almost finishing the bomber with engineering assistance, right? But not completing it because we are going to load the transport. And by the time the bomber is finished, the transport is being loaded. Now, this bomber is going to hunt engineers, and it's going to hunt engineers in the base of a player where the ACU has left it, right? The ACU of the middle player is going to be here reclaiming some stuff. So if we use this transport on this base, then we are only going to run into engineers and not we are not going to run into the ACU, right? And the engineers are going to be killed by this bomber, or at least some of them. So let's say there are 10 engineers and the bomber kills 5 or 6, and then there are 4 or 5 engineers left. And since we have 6 on the transport and they are all in the same spot, we can throw down a point defense and the enemy will not be able to outspeed us with his point defense. Of course, it's important that you don't mass stall while you're doing that, so we are only taking 1 mass extractor and not more. When the ACU is finished expanding, it's going to build 1 factory for extra engineers because we are so low on build power. And the engineers landed, and they are going to build point defenses in the enemy base. And these are going to kill upgrading mass extractors, engineers, the hydro, the land factory. They are basically going to kill everything. So the way this build is countered is by an early bomber. And when you run into a bomber, you want to build anti-air and you want to spread out the engineers. But usually there is not a lot you can do against the bomber. So the engineers are going to die, but they have still built the point defenses, and this is all you wanted, right? This is how you can lock 1 player out of the game very quickly. So have fun experimenting with this. As I said, this is not a gap-only build. You can use it on many maps. And enjoy!